The 2025 period has witnessed unprecedented changes within the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, revealing a pattern of policy modifications that correlate closely with external legal pressures and social challenges. These changes, while presented as spiritual progress, demonstrate a reactive approach to mounting criticism and regulatory scrutiny rather than proactive divine guidance. The most significant transformation involves disfellowshipping practices, where the organization quietly replaced the term disfellowshipped with removed from the congregation in their 2024 publications. This semantic shift was accompanied by substantial modifications to shunning practices, allowing members to greet removed individuals at meetings, though social exclusion continues in many locations with inconsistent implementation across different congregations. The timing of these changes directly correlates with legal challenges in Norway, where the organization faced unprecedented scrutiny. In March 2024, the Oslo District Court ruled that Jehovah's Witnesses' practice of disfellowshipping members, particularly minors, violated Norwegian legislation on religious communities. The court determined that these practices imposed negative social control and psychological violence against children, contradicting Norway's Religious Communities Act. However, the legal landscape shifted in March 2025 when the Borgarting Court of Appeal reversed this decision, ruling that the government had not presented sufficient evidence to prove that disfellowshipping practices violated children's rights or imposed restrictions on religious freedom. Despite this reversal, the Norwegian government appealed to the Supreme Court, and as of August 2025, the case remains pending with no final decision issued. This legal uncertainty has clearly influenced organizational policy changes. The modifications to disfellowshipping practices were implemented during the period of maximum legal pressure, suggesting that institutional protection rather than spiritual revelation drove these decisions. The organization's response to legal challenges reveals a pattern of reactive policy adjustment designed to minimize regulatory consequences, while maintaining core control mechanisms. The beard policy reversal represents another significant departure from long-established organizational culture. In December 2023, Stephen Lett announced that wearing beards was now a personal decision, stating that the scriptures do not condemn facial hair. This change reversed over a century of informal, but strictly enforced prohibition that had prevented countless men from holding positions and privileges within the organization. For generations, the absence of formal policy documentation regarding beards created a particularly insidious form of control. Men understood that growing facial hair would result in loss of assignments and social standing, yet the organization could deny having any official beard prohibition when challenged. This allowed them to maintain plausible deniability while enforcing conformity through social pressure and implicit consequences. The elimination of time reporting requirements marked the end of a practice central to Jehovah's Witness culture since 1920. Beginning November 1, 2023, congregation publishers were no longer required to submit monthly reports of ministry hours, literature placements, or return visits to congregation elders. Instead, members now simply indicate their participation in ministry activities without specific quantification. This change dismantled the entire foundation for measuring spiritual progress, qualifying individuals for appointments, and evaluating congregation health that had existed for over a century. The hourly reporting system had created rigid hierarchies within congregations, with those reporting higher numbers receiving recognition, privileges, and advancement opportunities. The sudden elimination of these requirements, presented as focusing on quality over quantity, came without explanation for why a practice previously promoted as spiritually essential was no longer necessary. Dress code modifications implemented throughout 2024 allowed women to wear pants to meetings and men to attend without ties or suit jackets. These changes represented a departure from appearance standards that had been maintained for decades and were understood by members to reflect important spiritual principles about modesty, respectability, and proper representation of the organization. The previous dress standards had created financial hardship for members in lower economic brackets, who struggled to maintain appropriate wardrobes for meetings and ministry activities. The organization provided no assistance for these costs, while maintaining that proper dress was essential for spiritual privileges and congregation standing. The 2025 relaxation of these requirements came without acknowledgement of the financial burden previously imposed or explanation for why formerly essential spiritual principles were suddenly optional. Educational policy underwent significant modification in August 2025, when David Splane announced that additional education was a personal choice, and that elders and others should not judge someone's decision in this regard. This statement contradicted decades of organizational guidance that had strongly discouraged higher education, describing universities as spiritually dangerous environments that would lead faithful members away from truth. This policy shift came without acknowledgement of how previous educational discouragement had affected thousands of young Jehovah's Witnesses who had foregone educational opportunities, limiting their career prospects and earning potential based on organizational guidance. Many members now work in lower-paying positions while supporting the organization financially, creating economic dependency that serves institutional interests while limiting individual options. Mental health guidance evolved significantly when the Watchtower publication in 2023 recognized the importance of professional psychological treatment in certain circumstances beyond spiritual solutions. This represented a major shift from previous positions that suggested spiritual activities were sufficient for addressing all emotional and psychological challenges, while expressing skepticism about worldly therapeutic approaches. This change came without acknowledgement of how previous discouragement of mental health treatment may have contributed to documented problems within the organization, including elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and psychological distress among members and former members. The organization's high-control environment, combined with previous prohibition on seeking outside help, had created conditions that mental health professionals identified as potentially harmful. Child abuse reporting procedures underwent complete transformation in 2025, when new legislation in Washington state required religious leaders, including Jehovah's Witness elders, to report child abuse to authorities even when revealed in confession. This mandate represents a complete reversal of the organization's previous two-witness policy, which had required corroborating testimony before taking action on abuse allegations. The implementation of mandatory reporting policies came only after devastating legal settlements and ongoing investigations that threatened the organization's legal status and financial stability. These changes were implemented to comply with legal requirements rather than representing proactive child protection measures or acknowledgement of previous policy deficiencies. Financial practices also underwent modification in 2025, with the organization relaxing some standards regarding donations and investments, allowing greater flexibility in areas such as gifts and celebrations while maintaining other restrictions. These changes came after increased scrutiny of organizational investment practices and questions about consistency between member restrictions and institutional behavior. The handling of doubts and questioning evolved to include more graduated responses rather than immediate disfellowshipping for expressing concerns. Beginning in 2025, the organization adopted a more nuanced approach to dealing with members who raise questions or express doubts, implementing counseling and temporary restrictions rather than complete expulsion, provided individuals avoid public criticism of organizational practices. This modification appears designed to contain dissent more effectively, while maintaining the appearance of openness to legitimate questions. However, members who speak publicly about concerns continue to face severe consequences, creating a two-tiered system for managing criticism that prioritizes information control over genuine accountability. The pattern emerging from these 2025 changes reveals an organization responding primarily to external pressures rather than implementing proactive spiritual guidance. Each major policy modification addresses specific legal, regulatory, or social challenges the organization has faced, with timing that consistently follows rather than precedes external criticism or consequences. The Norwegian legal proceedings particularly demonstrate this reactive approach. The organization's modifications to disfellowshipping practices occurred during the period of maximum legal pressure, despite the subsequent appeal court reversal. This suggests that institutional protection concerns, rather than spiritual insight, drove the timing and nature of these changes. The cumulative effect of these modifications represents the most significant transformation of Jehovah's Witness practices in recent history, yet the organization continues to present these changes as evidence of progressive revelation and divine guidance. This messaging appears designed to maintain member loyalty while implementing necessary adjustments to avoid legal consequences or membership losses. The lack of acknowledgement for previous policies and their impact on members represents a significant accountability gap. Members who made major life decisions based on teachings that are now being modified receive no recognition of their sacrifices, compensation for their losses, or assistance in addressing resulting limitations to their lives and opportunities. For current members, these changes present fundamental challenges to understanding organizational claims about unchanging truth and divine direction. Many have structured their entire lives around policies that are now being quietly abandoned without explanation of why formerly important principles are no longer maintained or how these changes relate to previous teachings about organizational infallibility. The organization's communication strategy consistently frames these reactive changes as proactive spiritual advancement, using sophisticated messaging to maintain member trust despite obvious contradictions between claims and actions. This approach demonstrates calculated management of member perceptions to serve institutional objectives, while avoiding accountability for previous errors or their consequences. The international scope and coordinated implementation of these modifications reveals the extent of centralized control within the organization, contradicting public statements about local autonomy and cultural adaptation. Policy changes originate from headquarters and are imposed uniformly across all regions, demonstrating an organizational structure more characteristic of corporate management than spiritual guidance. The evidence indicates that organizational policies have been driven more by legal and practical considerations than by spiritual principles or biblical interpretation. This reality challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature and source of organizational guidance that forms the foundation of member faith and obedience to institutional authority. As information about these patterns becomes more accessible through legal proceedings, media coverage, and independent investigation, the organization faces increasing difficulty maintaining traditional claims about divine direction while implementing obviously reactive policy changes. The response has been to accelerate necessary modifications while restricting member access to information about the reasons behind these changes. The ultimate significance of these 2025 changes extends beyond individual policy modifications to reveal the fundamental character of an organization that has consistently prioritized institutional interests over member welfare, transparency, and accountability. The pattern of reactive changes, limited acknowledgement of previous errors, and sophisticated messaging designed to maintain control despite obvious contradictions raises serious questions about the organization's claims and the foundation of member trust. The Norwegian legal proceedings, despite their uncertain outcome, have already achieved their intended effect by forcing policy modifications that the organization had resisted for decades. This demonstrates that external pressure, rather than internal spiritual guidance, serves as the primary driver of organizational change and policy development. For those examining these issues objectively, the 2025 changes provide clear evidence that the organization operates as a human institution responding to practical challenges rather than as a divinely guided entity receiving progressive revelation. The timing, nature, and implementation of these modifications consistently reflect damage control and risk management rather than spiritual insight or prophetic direction. The challenge for current members lies in reconciling these obvious patterns with their beliefs about organizational divine guidance and exclusive access to truth. The sophisticated messaging and information control mechanisms make this reconciliation difficult, as questioning organizational explanations has been programmed as spiritual weakness rather than intellectual honesty or legitimate concern for truth and accountability.